Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the most famous ideas coming from Blaise Pascal's Pensées is what has come to be called the wager, Pascal's wager, used as an argument for the existence of God. And it's been presented by many people in many different forms, but it's very important in order to understand what Pascal meant by the wager to look at what he actually wrote and not engage in some sort of reduction or summary of it, because those often lose the point. It's much more complex and well thought out than is often presented. Now, why does Pascal provide this argument, or this discourse, as he calls it, within the Pensées? It is indeed there for the purpose of getting somebody to behave in a certain way. And he doesn't think it's actually going to produce belief right away. So that's already a strange sort of philosophical argument. But it does provide, in his view, good grounds for committing one's life in a certain way, which will then eventually lead to some sort of knowledge, or at least conviction. And he says, if there is a God, he's infinitely incomprehensible, since having neither parts nor limits, he has no affinity to us. Who will blame Christians for not being able to give a reason for their belief? And so this is the background to this context. And then he says, it's in lacking proofs that they're not lacking in sense. And he says, let's examine this point about arguments for the existence of God. So the backdrop of this entire discourse is that philosophical or theological proofs, that are supposed to be completely convincing, aren't really so. All you need to do is look through the history of the philosophy of religion to find arguments for, arguments against, arguments criticizing both of those, and that people have found these sometimes convincing and sometimes unconvincing. Sometimes the same person has found the same argument convincing at one point and unconvincing at another. So Pascal says, listen, reason by itself cannot actually tell us the answer to this question. Does God exist or doesn't God exist? And yet we know that either God does exist or God does not exist. And he's got this beautiful metaphor here. He says, there is an infinite chaos which separates us from a genuine knowledge of this answer. And he says a game is being played at the extremity of this infinite distance where heads or tails will turn up. A game is being played. Pascal is looking at this as a gambler, something that he actually knew quite a lot about, both from experience and in a sort of theoretical or intellectual way. If you don't know this, Pascal is in fact one of the people who helps to invent the theory of probability. And why does he do that? Because he's interested in gambling. So he conceives of this as a game in which either God exists or not, and we're going to find out in the end, but we don't know right now. So, just like having cards in front of you, if somebody's playing 3-card Monte with you, or you're about to throw dice, playing craps, what is the number going to be? Or you're flipping cards, or whatever else it is that you're doing, even down to the level of just having, a ball in one hand and not in the other hand, assuming you didn't play, sleight of hand with somebody and hide it up your sleeve. You don't know when you bet. So Pascal looks at this as a wager. Now, he considers one thing at the start. Maybe we shouldn't bet anything. Maybe the prudent, rational thing to do is not to wager. He says, according to reason, you can do neither the one thing nor the other. According to reason, you can defend neither of the propositions, God exists or God does not exist. So, don't reprove for error those who've made a choice. Not this, he says, you don't know anything about it. And somebody could say, I don't blame them for the choice they made. I blame them for making a choice in the first place. Unless you know with 100% certainty, you shouldn't commit yourself one way or another. Don't be a theist, believing that God exists. Don't be an atheist, claiming that God doesn't exist. Be an agnostic. And Pascal says, okay, you can choose that point of view, but you really do have to make a choice. We're embarked, as he says. We're on the journey. And you could say, well, I don't have to make a choice. I can keep my mind blank or suspend assent or anything like that. And Pascal would point out, well, you have to choose the way that you're going to live. You have to choose how you commit yourself. So he says, you have to wager, it's not optional. You're embarked. Which will you choose then? And this is where the argument actually begins. Which of these will you choose? Let's look at it knowing that we couldn't use reason before to decide God's existence or not. Let's look at it rationally, and let's look at it like gamblers, he says. So he says, since you have to choose, let's lay out what the particular goods and bads and the risks are. You have two things to lose, he says, the true and the good. You have two things, and he's actually talking about four things here. You have two things to stake. Your reason, your faculty of reason, and your will, that part of you that makes decisions and which is oriented towards the good for us. He paraphrases this as knowledge and happiness. And this is really the key thing here, happiness. That is one of the things that you are staking or risking. And he says your nature has two things to shun, error and misery. So we want knowledge and happiness, the true and the good, things that are for our reason and will. We want to avoid error and misery. How do we do this? Okay, so we can lay this out almost like a table with four cells within it and two options on each side. First option has to do with something we might say factual. God exists. God doesn't exist. There is a God, there isn't a God. And we're not worried about what kind of God it is or anything like that. That's one of the criticisms that gets made of this argument. But let's first see what he's saying. So either God exists in one column, and you've got two choices there for yourself, or God does not exist, and you've got two choices. What are those choices? Pascal says you can bet on God, or you can bet against God. Bet against God's existence. Obviously, you're not betting against God if God doesn't exist. And what are you betting? What are you staking? You are staking your life. What it is that you have. You are literally betting your life on God or against God. Because it's the thing that you actually do have to stake. So he says, let's take a look at this now. Let's weigh the gain and the loss in wagering that God exists. Let's estimate the two chances. If you gain, if you win, because you bet on God when God actually does exist, then you win big. As a matter of fact, you don't just win big, you win biggest. You win infinitely big. There is no comparison between what you win in this column and anything else that you've ever won in your life. Just by, the definition of what it is that you win. Eternal life for an eternity. Eternal happiness. So he says, wager then without hesitation that he is. And then he says, maybe I wager too much. Why would I be wagering too much? This almost seems like a no-brainer at the start, doesn't it? Hey, you can win an infinitely good thing. well, that's kind of a distant proposition. He talks about the possibility of being infinitely distant a little bit later on. And Pascal goes on to say, let's think about this just as we would for anything else. So here's how he reasons it out. There is an equal risk of gain and loss. Now, why does he say an equal risk of gain and loss? Why is it 50-50 odds? Because we don't know any better. Reason can't say, well, it's 70-30 or 149 to 1 or anything like that. That's not the area where reason can actually help us out. So for the moment, let's just assume it is like a flip of a coin. God exists 50%. God doesn't exist equally 50% possible. You bet on God. You're wagering your life, which is pretty valuable to you, but you could win something much greater down the line. And he says, listen, if we just understood this in terms of lives, how would you bet? What would be the rational thing to do? If it was a 50-50 chance, if it was, 2 to 1, then if you're betting one life and you're going to win one life, maybe that's not a good bet to take. Because you're likely to come out just where you started. And you could lose that life. But if you can win 3 lives and the odds are 2 to 1, it's actually irrational for you not to bet, Pascal says, because you have a greater chance of winning. No, you don't have a greater chance of winning. The payoff is greater, rather. So he says, you would be imprudent when you're forced to play not to chance your life to gain 3 at a game where there's equal risk of loss and gain. And then he says, listen, what we're talking about here is an eternity of life and happiness. So if there were an infinity of chances, of which only one would be for you, you would still be right in wagering 1 to win 2, and you would act stupidly being obliged to play by refusing to stake 1 life against 3 at a game in which out of an infinity of chances there is 1 for you. If there were an infinity of an infinitely happy life to gain. He does use that phrase, an infinity of an infinitely happy life to gain. He says that's what the case is. That's what we're assuming here if God does exist. So it makes sense to engage in this wager. He also says, what are you actually risking? By comparison to the infinity, whatever loss you're going to incur if God doesn't exist is finite. It's almost nothing. It's almost like you get to gamble, you get to buy a ticket for nothing that could have an infinite payoff. Now, there is a downside to this. What if God doesn't exist? Well, then we could think of how you're going to live your life, because it's not just about believing, it's about behaving. And you would have some sort of finite loss. You can't, say, break the 10 Commandments, go around sleeping with everybody else's spouses, lying, cheating, stealing, killing people. But that's a finite loss. As a matter of fact, towards the end, Pascal actually considers this. He says, what harm is going to befall you in taking this side? You will be faithful, honest, humble, grateful, generous, a sincere friend, truthful. Why? Because you actually want to behave as if God exists and if God cares about your behavior. Certainly you will not have those pleasures of glory and luxury, but will you not have others? He says, I tell you, you will thereby gain in this life. Now, we might say, okay, Pascal, you're overselling that part. You've got to pass up a lot of creature comforts and a lot of fun stuff if you actually want to behave like a Christian and, bet on God existing. So maybe let's call this finite loss. What if you bet on God not existing and you're right about that? God doesn't exist. Finite gain. You get to sleep in on Sunday or Saturday or whenever the Sabbath happens to be for whatever church you're talking about. You can violate certain moral norms. You don't have to follow certain dietary restrictions, perhaps. So you have a much more fun time, but it's a finite gain. It pales in comparison to the infinite good that you could be winning if God did exist and you bet on God. If you bet against God and you get it wrong, you also, unless God chooses to be merciful, wind up with infinite evil. Now, Pascal doesn't talk about this quite so much, but that could also, if you're a prudent gambler, be something that you want to take into account. And so he says that, there's just as many risks on one side as on the other, so the course is to play even, and the certainty of the stake here, the certainty of the stake of what we're risking on this on this side, our life, our happiness, our pleasure, is offset by the infinity of happiness or misery that we could endure over here. Now, he does also finish up by a few interesting reflections, or rather dialogue with a potential discourse partner. So he says, we've demonstrated this, our proposition is of infinite force when there is the finite to stake in a game where there are equal risks of gain and loss, and the infinite to gain. He says, this is demonstrable, this is a proof, and if men are capable of any truths, this is one. So his dialogue partner says to him then, all right, I admit that you're right about this. Is there any way that I could actually flip the cards over and see what the faces of the cards are? I want to hedge my bets a little bit. I want to get some insider knowledge about what the gamble is. And Pascal says, yes, Scripture and the rest. And he says, but I have my hands tied and my mouth closed. I'm forced to wager. I'm not free. I'm not released, and I am made so I cannot believe. What then would you have me to do? So Pascal here says, well, there's a bunch of different things you can do. You can look at other people who are stuck in this same situation, making an equal wager, look at their lives, think about whether it makes sense for them to do what they're doing. You can try to convince yourself, he says, not by increase of proofs of God, but by the abatement of your passions. So what we would nowadays call emotional management, or developing some sort of augmented emotional intelligence, would help you to sort this out a little bit better and understand why it makes even more sense to pick one side over the other. So this is the fullness of Pascal's presentation of the wager. You notice that it's not quite so simple as just saying, well, you should bet on God because, infinite good versus infinite misery and only finite goods. There's more involved here. Reason at the very beginning has been sort of put aside. A 50-50 odds have been established, but Pascal also has another argument in his pocket. Even if it's not 50-50, but say 90-10, or even if there's just a infinitely small chance, the prospect of infinite happiness seems to outweigh that. And this is nested within a larger conception of how it is that we rationally choose where to commit our lives one way or the other. So this is genuinely Pascal's wager.